welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the lands that I'm going to be putting in my commander decks. I can't believe I haven't made a video about this before. Actually, funny enough, I was thinking about it the other day, and I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should make a video just talking about what lands we should be putting in our commander decks, right? Of course, my channel is EDH Deck Building. It's all about what cards you're going to be using in your commander decks, and one of the most fundamental parts of putting a deck together is what lands you're going to be using. I have done my utility lands series, right? I talked about all the colorless utility lands that you could be putting in, of course, any commander deck because they are colorless. And then I went over all of the individual colors as well and all of the multicolored options. So if you're looking for the utility options, you can go check out that playlist. I got a whole playlist of the utility lands that you could be putting in your deck. And I would recommend it because there's a lot of really great lands that you could easily shoehorn in your deck that you might be missing out on that could really help with your commander decks. This video, however, is just talking about the lands as they sort of were originally intended, right? Which is just tapping for mana. What lands are we putting on our deck just to cast the spells we want to cast? Very fundamental, probably the most fundamental part of putting any deck together, right? This is the list that I've put together. If I'm making a commander deck, where do I start, right? I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go down the list with regards to the lands I'm putting in my deck. So first of all, I'll just say stipulation number one, I'm not going to be talking about any basic lands in here. I think that goes without saying. I know a lot of people are going to say forest or island. I'm not talking about the basic lands here. I think we all know about that one. Don't need to cover it. Of course, there is also two other really important aspects to putting lands in your commander decks. And as we all know, cost is a big one, right? You're not just going to put the best lands you can in any given option. Cost sometimes will be a drawback for you, and I am taking that into consideration. I'm just like any other Magic player, right? I'm not a bottomless pit of money here. I can't just buy all the most expensive and the best lands for all my commander decks. I do take cost into consideration when I'm building my own personal commander decks. However, I'm not like super budget either, right? This has never been a super budget channel. I would say I'm somewhere in the middle, I guess. So as someone who is somewhere in the middle, these are going to be the options that I normally use. Obviously, the other really important consideration here is the colors that you are playing. And as I have mentioned on my channel more times than I can count, I do not have any decks that are more than two colors. All of my decks are either two or one color. So I divide everything into two categories. As far as I'm concerned anyway, everything is either two colors or less or three colors or more. So covering the last one first, right? If I'm putting a deck together, and of course I do build decks for both my channel and also for my patrons that are three or more colors. So if I'm doing so, what lands am I putting in? And of course, I'm probably going to start with the triomes. Of course, those are auto includes if you're in any three color combination. If you're in a 4 or 5 color deck, you're probably going to want to put as many as you can in there because they're going to fix you in 3 colors. More importantly, they're also the land types, right? So they're doubly important because they are 3 colors, but also the land types, which means you can get them with fetch lands or certain ramp options. They're just an auto include, right? They are kind of expensive again, but for me, if I'm putting a 3 color deck together, I am at least going to get that one triome that fits that one 3 color combination, right? Because being able to go fetch that one land to fix me in all 3 of my colors can be really advantageous. Before we ever got the triomes though, we had the other 3 color combination lands. I'm not sure if we have a name for them, but they are the lands that we originally had before the triomes came out that were all those different 3 color combinations. And again, if I'm in specifically a 3 color deck, I'm going to put that land in, right? If I'm in an Esper deck, I'm going to put that Arcane Sanctum in my deck. No question about it. Why wouldn't I want a land that is going to enter the battlefield tapped? Sure, okay, but give me all the colors I need, right? It's essentially giving me any color because it's giving me the colors that I need for my deck. Auto include for me if I'm putting a 3 color deck together, right? I'm going to have that one land that taps for all the colors that I need. And of course, that's about it for 3 colors or more, right? There's only 2 cycles of lands that are adding the 3 colors. And there, of course, is no lands that are adding 4 colors or 5 colors, but I guess there are lands that are adding all colors. And I guess I got to give a shout out to Command Tower. Again, it's almost like talking about basic lands where what's really the point? We all know it exists. And of course, it can go in any commander deck. There's not really a reason to put it in a monocolor deck. Other than that, it's probably the most played card in the entire format. Don't really need to talk about it. Exotic Orchard maybe is another one that I could give a mention mention where the more colors I play, the more likely I am to play it, right? For me, Exotic Orchard, I don't know if I would put it in a 3-color deck, maybe, but certainly I would put it in a 4 or 5-color deck because it's going to probably tap for like 3, 4, or possibly even 5 mana, depending on what my opponents have in play, right? It's tapping for a mana of whatever my opponents control. So it's for sure going to give me a couple of colors that I need, and it's possible that it will give me all the colors I need, even if I'm in a 5-color deck. All right, let's move on to the 2-color combinations, which I would say is probably the most important. And again, if you're in 3-color decks, 4-color decks, all of this stuff applies as well, but I'm just going to be talking about it in regards to the 2-color combinations. So of course, we have to start with the dual lands, right? The OG dual lands, which of course we all know are the best option in any 2-color combination because they don't enter the battlefield tapped and they have those land types that we want on our lands. I don't have any of myself. I don't play them in any of my decks. Of course, they are ridiculously expensive. If you got them, you could put them in your decks. Again, not much to talk about here other than if you got them, you play them, right? For me, I don't have them in any decks myself. I also do not have any of the fetch lands, right? And I mean the expensive versions of the fetch lands because there are more versions, right? The Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs fetch lands, the pay 1 life, go search your library for those 2 basic land types, put it into play. Another important reason why those land types really matter on the lands we are getting. I currently have none in any of my commander decks. I think in a 2-color deck, they're really not that important. 2-color deck really shouldn't have any problem at all mana fixing. So a fetch land really isn't that necessary. If I'm putting a 2-color deck together, and my advice to anyone else out there who is putting a 2-color deck together, maybe if you're new to this format, I wouldn't go out there and spend the money on a fetch land for your 2-color deck. I don't think it's necessary. Again, if you happen to have one lying around, sure, why not throw it in there? It does thin out your deck as well, which in the commander format, I don't think is really that important. But in a 2-color deck, mana fixing isn't super important, so they're not really that needed. Of course, as you go up in the colors, it becomes more and more important, right? Again, we can get those triomes with the fetch lands, which can be really, really important in 3 and 4 and 5-color decks. There is the other cycle of fetch lands, right? The lesser known one that enters the battlefield tapped, and then you can sacrifice, right? They essentially do the same thing. They're just 1 turn slower, which of course makes them worse, but they are an option. Obviously, they're a way cheaper option, and I would certainly give that consideration. Again, I don't know if I would necessarily put it in a 2-color deck. I don't know if it's needed. You could, certainly. It will help mana fix you. It will get those land types again, if you're specifically looking for that. For me, I don't typically put them in my 2-color decks, but you certainly could. And again, in the more color combinations, they get even better. Where do I go next? I go to the shock lands, of course, commander staples since forever, and I guess staples in pretty much every format since forever because, again, they have those land types. They are the, I guess, fair version of the dual lands where they come into play tapped unless you pay the 2 life. So you have the option, right? Do I want to pay the 2 life? Maybe I need to, maybe I don't. If I'm playing my shock land on turn 1, maybe I don't have a first turn play, so I'll just let it come into play tapped. If I want to cast something, then it comes into play untapped. The option is fantastic. Of course, they're going to go in every 2-color deck if you got them. They're not super expensive. I think they're right in that decent range as far as getting a land for your commander deck. Next for me is the battlebond lands. What I call the battlebond lands, I'm not sure what the actual name is for them. They enter the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, which of course in a commander game is almost always going to be the case. They're only going to enter the battlefield tapped unless you've killed the other 2 guys or someone else has and you're down to that single opponent, in which case it's probably later in the game, not a big deal that they enter the battlefield tapped. So really almost no downside at all. For me, the battlebond lands are just slam dunks in any 2-color combination. Again, kind of expensive for that reason, but if you got them, you should be putting them in there. Where I go next after shock lands and battlebond lands is the check lands. And of course, check lands is a term that maybe gets used for a lot of different things. Basically, you are checking to see what land is already in play, right? That's where the name comes from. For me, the best check land series is the Drowned Catacomb Clifftop Retreat series. I'm not sure exactly what we call this, but the one that it enters the battlefield unless you control just a single land of those 2 types, right? So Clifftop Retreat is going to enter the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a plains, which in a Boros deck is going to be super super easy, right? First turn, I play a mountain or plains, and then my clifftop retreat comes into play untapped the very next turn. Pretty fantastic. This is an auto include for me if I'm in a 2-color deck. Again, not very expensive at all either. Really one of the best options as far as I'm concerned with regards to 2-color lands. And again, looking at those land types, right? This doesn't have to be a basic island or swamp. I can have one of those triomes in play, and my drowned catacomb will enter the battlefield untapped if that triome is either an island or a swamp. I really like this land series a lot. There also is the land series that looks for the basic lands, which I like a little bit less, but is pretty good in just the 2-color combination, right? So like Canopy Vista or Prairie Stream, right? They enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Again, in a 2-color deck, it's likely you will have those basic lands pretty early, but also they do have the land types. So that is where they might be better than the other check land series where they have the land types. You can go get them with the ramp or the fetch lands or the whatever. So if you're specifically looking for that, it might be good. Again, for me in a 2-color deck, mana fixing isn't nearly as important. I am more concerned about my lands entering the battlefield untapped than I am for them having the land types. The land types usually is only important with regards to mana fixing because I can fetch them. And in a 2-color deck, I don't care as much about that. I care more about they enter the battlefield untapped. So that's why I would go with the other check land series first. Speaking of which though, next up I'm going to go with the cycle lands. These ones always enter the battlefield tapped. So of course that's not great, but I really like the cycling option on there. Again, they have the land types. So if I'm looking for lands that have the land types, I like those ones first because I can go fetch them if I want to, but also later in a game, I can cycle them away if I'm drawing lands off the top of my library that I don't really need, right? I really dislike drawing lands off the top of my library on like turn 8 or 9 when I'm looking for gas. I want maybe a removal spell, something that can help close out the game. Being able to cycle away that land I don't really want to me is very valuable. That's why I lean towards that series of lands in a 2-color deck typically. Next up, we got the scry lands, and I know a lot of people have sort of shied away from these in recent times. I still really like them. 2 colors again, and they're going to enter the battlefield tapped, but will allow you to scry 1. And I don't love lands that always enter the battlefield tapped. They don't have an untapped version. However, I just really like the scry. I know it doesn't seem like much, but one of my favorite things to do in a commander game is play that first turn scry land. It can be really valuable on turn 1. I don't usually have a first turn play in a lot of my decks, so if I see that scry land in my opening hand, I really like it a lot. I like to see 3 lands in my opening hand. That for me is pretty good. 2 is not a lot. However, if I have 2 lands in my opening hand and one of them is a scry land, I can scry on turn 1, see that I don't have a land on top of my library, tuck it on the bottom, so it is going to increase the chances that I draw another land. If I have, say, 4 lands in my opening hand, that's kind of a lot. So again, I can scry land on turn 1, see that there's a land maybe on top of my library. I don't need that. I already got 4 in my opening hand. I tuck it on the bottom of my library, right? So I really like the scry lands, mostly for that turn 1 play. Next up, we got the bounce lands. And I'm going deep here, right? I'm getting to the lands that I'm probably actually not necessarily going to play. I might or I might not. It depends on the color combination I am in. As I just talked about in my deck doctor video that I did, I sort of went on a rant about the lands that I would play in a green deck, and bounce lands for me are not going to be ever played in a green deck unless I specifically want to be returning lands to my hand, getting landfall triggers, stuff like that, right? I'm playing that bounce land, and of course it's going to bounce a land I control the owner's hand. So if I want to make land drops, it can be good. It is also mana fixing, but in a green deck, I don't really need to do that. It is not ramping, okay? Let me make that clear. A lot of people might see that land that is tapping for 2 mana and think that it is ramping. It is not. Again, if you're in that very unique situation where you are untapping your lands all the time, it can be good, of course, because you have that one land that's tapping for 2 mana that you can untap and use again. That's a rare situation, right? That's not going to be happening a lot. If I'm also in that rare situation, like maybe that Arcellos deck, where I can have my bounce land enter the battlefield untapped, then again, it's extra good. But in almost every other situation, it's not going to be ramp, right? I'm not saying it's not good. It just isn't ramp. I want to make that clear because a lot of people, I think, might think that it is. As I've talked about on my channel before in the past, one of the worst plays I ever see in Commander, I see it all the time, is turn 1, I play a basic land. Turn 2, I play my bounce land and return my basic land to hand. Of course, The bounce land is tapped, so I'm doing nothing on turn 2. I have now 8 cards in hand, and I'm discarding to hand size. And then on turn 3, I replay the land that I had before, so I just have 3 mana on turn 3. There is no advantage there, right? You're not ramping. Maybe you're mana fixing a little because that bounce land taps for 2 mana of the colors you probably need, but you're not really up anything, right? That is not a good play. You have discarded to hand size for essentially nothing, right? If you have a bounce land in your opening hand, make sure it works out for you, right? Don't keep that opening hand with a bounce land in it. And if you only have one other land, that is not a good keep in my opinion. Or at the very least, make sure you have a first turn play so you're not discarding to hand size. The bounce lands can be really tricky. For me, I don't use them a lot. I have them in a couple of decks, certainly not the green ones, but in a 2-color deck where you're not playing green, they can be pretty decent. All right, I'm going to end off talking about a couple other obviously really important lands in the Commander format. Of course, we got Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. Those are cards that are obviously Commander staples. They've been printed 1,000 times. They go in a lot of decks. Funny enough, I've seen people put these cards in their monocolor decks, which I think is a little weird. I mean, again, people like the whole idea of thinning out your deck. If you want landfall triggers, they're great, of course, because they enter the battlefield and then you crack them and you get another landfall trigger when you go fetch that land. If you can play lands from your graveyard, they're extra good because, of course, you can replay them again. Crucible of Worlds, I keep getting that Evolving Wilds out of my library, playing it again. There's a lot of situations where they're extra good. However, you are slowing down a little bit, right? You're getting a land that comes into play tapped. Again, it's just like playing a land that is tapped. It's essentially the same thing. It's not getting land types. It's only getting basic lands, right? You can't get a Triumph with it like you would with any of those other fetch lands. I don't play them a lot. For me personally, again, in a 2-color deck, I don't really need to fix that badly. And in 3 colors or more, there's probably way better options for mana fixing. They're great budget options for sure. But for me, I'm probably only going to put Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse in my decks if I specifically want to be cracking lands for whatever reason, sending stuff to my graveyard, having stuff leave the battlefield, and scenarios like that. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Myriad Landscape. Again, another Commander staple since forever. And for me, Myriad Landscape, again, is only going to be played in my monocolor decks. I'm probably not going to play it in a 2-color deck or anything above that. Of course, mana fixing, not really great, right? Because it's searching for 2 basic lands of the same name, so you can't get different lands. It's not like a Burnished Heart where I can go get 2 different basic lands. Myriad Landscape only gets the same kind of basic land. So in a 2-color deck, I don't love it. It's really slow, enters the battlefield tapped. You got to pay 2, sacrifice it. You're basically eating up an entire turn to go get those lands, which is okay if you're getting exactly the lands you need. And of course, in a 2-color deck, you might not. You might be sitting there with 1 swamp and 1 island in play going, okay, do I get swamps or do I get islands? Which one are you going to get with your Myriad Landscape? That could be a really tough decision. I don't really love it there. I prefer it in my monocolor decks. And again, of course, not green. We don't need to be doing a Myriad Landscape in our green decks. There's way, way better options for ramping in mono green, obviously, but any other mono-colored, non-green, I am going to be playing Myriad Landscape. I do like it there as a ramp option. That is it. That is all. That is the lands that I'm going to be putting in my deck that is just tapping for mana, right? These are just the lands I'm putting in my deck to mana fix me in the colors I'm playing. Again, I typically play 2-color decks or less, but I do build 3 and 4 and 5-color decks all the time for my channel and my patrons. Again, I'm talking about the options I use for myself. Where do I go? I'm putting a deck together. Where do I start? And then I start going down the list of the lands that I will be playing. And obviously, if I'm playing a 3-color deck, I'm going to start with those Triumphs, those 3-color lands. Then I'm going to move on to maybe the Shock lands and so on down the list. You guys let me know. What are the lands you're going to be putting in your decks? Where do you start? What do you think is the best land cycle? Besides maybe the obvious choices, what are some of the ones that maybe I didn't mention in this video? Let me know in the comments below. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.